Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis, and this is Ann Magazine's Ground Truth. And today we're going to be talking about China, starting with the coronavirus, but moving on from there to the broader issues of sort of whither China. And with us, maybe one of the best guys on the planet to talk about these issues, Gordon Chang, who, among other things, is the author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China. And you can find on Twitter at Gordon, Gordon G. Chang, Gordon G. Chang. Mr. Chang, welcome.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Well, thank you for taking the time, sir. Let's dive into this coronavirus situation. What's your take on what's really going on in China right now?
Well, Beijing says that the coronavirus outbreak is subsiding. There's over 2,000 deaths, about 75,000 or so infections, at least reported. The real numbers are multiples of that, and it's not clear to me that the virus is indeed on the way down. Xi Jinping, the Communist Party's ruler, is trying to get China back to work. And he needs to do that because in reality right now, the Chinese economy is in contraction. And that's a mortal threat for a ruling organization that derives much of its legitimacy from being able to say they are responsible for enduring prosperity. But we are seeing measures that Beijing is taking that are inconsistent with this narrative that the disease is going away. So at least for the moment, we've got to be very concerned what's occurring. And just one more thing, if this disease were indeed going away, I don't think we're seeing Beijing right now exclude and rebuff the U.S. CDC from investigating. Also, World Health Organization does have a team in China, but they're being kept away from the scene of the outbreak. And that's a very bad sign in terms of the way China is handling this.
You know, one of the things that strikes me, and I wrote something on this the other day, was something that I think you just touched on in passing, which is the inconsistency between the claims that the thing is, the epidemic or whatever we're going to call it is under control and we're moving out of this, and the scope of the measures they have taken. When you're talking a couple of thousand people dead in a country of 1.4 billion, but you lock down hundreds of millions of people, those two things don't fit together for me.
No, they don't. Also, what we're seeing are other signs of this. So, for instance, in the first week of March, the party holds its very important meetings. There's the National People's Congress, which is the central government's highest organ of authority. And as well, there is a consultative People's Congress meeting. And those two have been this year postponed. So that's a sign that this is not going away. Also, there have been other big events that have been canceled, and that's a real indication that Beijing is extremely concerned. Unfortunately, we don't know what the true state of this is, and perhaps people in the party don't know either. But we do know that since about January 26th or so, there's been extraordinary measures to suppress information. And when that occurs, the wildest rumors flourish. And it means that the rest of the world is just left perplexed.
Do you have a theory or a take on the question of whether this is in fact something that just is naturally occurring that came out of a seafood market, or whether this is something that came out of one of their labs?
We really do not know the answer to that question either. And as I mentioned, foreign investigators have been kept from Wuhan. There are two theories. One of them is, and this is the first one that we heard, was that it developed naturally from a wet market in Wuhan. And that would be consistent with how other outbreaks in China started. But people have also pointed out that China's highest level biosecurity lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a P4 level institution, is just 20 miles away from the outbreak. And The Lancet, which is the authoritative British medical journal, pointed out on its January 24 article that some of the initial cases have nothing to do with the wet market. And that, of course, has fueled the theory that this was either genetically modified and released or somehow escaped from that lab. Until we know more, I think that we have to say what Senator Tom Cotton has said, and that is all possibilities are still on the table.
Prospects that the Chinese are going to be forced to actually start telling us the truth about what's happening?
I think that that's probably the least likely thing that will happen in this. At some point, maybe we will see World Health Organization virologists in Wuhan. But right now, the regime is adamant, and Xi Jinping is his more important goal right now is to control the narrative. It's more important than ending the disease. So he's trying to get people back to work. And that's always a bad sign because although they may jumpstart the economy a little bit, what they will do is prolong the epidemic because as people go back to work, they will spread the disease and this will be a much longer affair. So right now, we can expect that this will be a significant factor in China, at least through April or May.
Right. So one of the things that I think a lot of people who are unclear on, just not focused on, is my understanding in China, what you have in the industrial centers is you have large numbers of workers who basically live in crowded dormitories most of the year and then return infrequently home. And so you're talking about restarting the economy. Presumably we have a lot of people, I'll use the term locked down, around the country. When you restart the economy and you push those people back into those dormitories, isn't that sort of the functional equivalent of jet fuel on a fire for an epidemic?
Absolutely. And you mentioned the word infrequently. Really, for many workers, it's once a year around the Lunar New Year holiday, which just occurred last month. So what we have right now, maybe about 30%, the last number was 26% of China's workers went back to work at the beginning of, I guess, this week. And that's a real indication that most of the workforce is, as you say, locked down or it doesn't want to work, largely because they think that by going out back into the public, they'll expose themselves to the disease. We know that China's government has established these big quarantine camps for workers. But those actually look to be like a cesspool of infection themselves and can actually spread the disease among people who are waiting to go back to work. So right now, you got a country which is very much in a state of semi-paralysis. The government is trying to get things opened up again, but I think probably almost certainly prematurely.
So I think the average American is generally aware, obviously, that of the concept of globalization and how much we buy from the Chinese. I'm not sure to what extent folks are focused on the fact that even if the product supposedly is made in the United States or elsewhere, that often components are coming out of China. In other words, it's not just a question of if the factory's not working in China, X product is not coming here. It also means manufacturers all over the planet are basically going to come to a halt. Is that accurate, or am I overblowing that?
No, you're absolutely accurate. So, for instance, Hyundai, the South Korean conglomerate, closed car plants in South Korea because they couldn't get parts from China. Fiat Chrysler closed the plant in Serbia. There's a Japanese car plant that was closed. I forget the maker. And in the United States, there has been talk that the Flint, Michigan GM plant assembly operation will have to change its method of operations because it can't get parts from China. That's also going to be true for GM assembly operations in Arlington, Texas, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. But it's the one at Flint which is the most at risk. So we're going to see this across the business landscape. Apple this week said that when it announced it was going to miss its revenue estimates for the quarter, also said that some products might become unavailable. and Apple certainly is going to have problems in that regard. We're going to see this across the board. People are saying that there will be shortages on the shelves of the big box retailers mid-April, maybe even before that, because they keep lean inventories and therefore are especially vulnerable to what you just described.
So, just broadening this topic out a little bit, one of the things that surprises me, I guess, in the press, is the extent to which people, maybe this will sound harsh, pay attention to what the Chinese government says. In other words, that the media, whether we're talking about the epidemic, the economy, anything else, there's an announcement by whatever state press entity, and then that's taken as if that's factual. When, in my estimation, what we're doing is listening to whatever the propaganda is of the Chinese Communist Party.
You're absolutely right about that. I'll give you one example. When news outlets report quarterly growth of the Chinese economy, they often just state 6.1%, which was the rate reported for 2019. They just reported this fact. What they should be saying, as announced by China, to make clear that this is a number that is announced. It's not necessarily reality, because there are many people in China who believe that the announced rates are far in excess of what is the real rate. And clearly right now, that's going to be even more the case, because the Communist Party right now is spending more resources and placing a higher priority on controlling the narrative about the coronavirus outbreak than it is in actually trying to end it. Because I think Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, sees that this is an existential threat to the Communist Party and to his position in that party.
So you have written, we talked about your book earlier, The Coming Collapse of China, and you've spoken on this topic and endless times. What do you see the prospects are long-term for the communist regime in China?
Anything can happen. And largely, we can see that a number of things. First of all, we know that Xi Jinping is trying to extend totalitarian controls. Many governments will do that in an outbreak, but the fear in China and elsewhere is that there will be no relaxation of those controls even after the coronavirus subsides. But really, there is a new attitude on the part of the Chinese people, and it's largely triggered by the death of that Wuhan whistleblower, the doctor, Li Wenliang, because he was part of what's known as the Wuhan 8. When Li died on February 7th, there was white-hot anger across social media platforms in China, and people started to not only be angry, they started to think about how the form of their government contributed to the outbreak. And so the hashtag I want freedom has actually went viral for a little while before those postings were taken down. Also, the unofficial anthem of China these days is "Do You Hear the People Sing?", which is a politically impactful song from Les Miserables. So right now we are witnessing people talk about Chernobyl, for instance, in connection with China, which is the event that sort of laid the groundwork for the fall of the Soviet Union. And people are talking about China's Chernobyl. So there is this narrative among the people of China that they need a new form of government because the disease is, yes, it's coronavirus, but the real disease is communism.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, and I'm no China expert, but in seeing the reaction to what you're talking about, the death of this doctor, was the parallel to, I think, of what we saw in Iran when finally the government admitted that, no, we actually shot down this airliner over Tehran. And there were just, it seemed to be for a lot of people sort of like the last straw, like, oh my God, not only are you grotesquely incompetent, but you will lie about anything and everything.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. That is, people in China know that the Communist Party lies, but there are tipping points, and we could very well have seen one. Now, as I mentioned, the party is going to extraordinary lengths to extend its controls, and that will work for at least a little while. but probably is going to fail in the long term because essentially the Chinese people have made up their mind. And one way or another, at some time or another, they will get rid of the party. And that'll be probably a good thing for the world because you look at China right now, I don't think that there are good solutions in the world possible as long as the Communist Party rules, which is not to say that the failure of the Communist Party is sufficient to make the world better, but at least it's a necessary condition. And I think that essentially countries around the world are starting to see the same thing.
So when we went down this path of, I don't know what the correct term is, normalization with China, but going into certainly economic cooperation with them. As I understand it, one of the ideas that was trotted out to justify why it was going to be a good thing for us to get in bed economically with the communist regime was that theoretically this was going to lead to liberalization, democratization. It would be great for the Chinese people, and obviously it has improved their standard of living. But as you've been detailing here for some time, we're not seeing the regime opening up. We're seeing them actually becoming more efficient at cracking down. Should we change our policy in regard to dealing with China?
Oh, absolutely. Because, as you point out, our policy since the early 1970s was try to build relations with the Communist Party and to integrate China into the international system. That just hasn't worked. And what we are witnessing right now is a change in the way that Washington views China. And we're seeing this in other capitals around the world because the Chinese themselves have made it clear that as they've grown stronger, they've not become benign. What they have become is more hostile, belligerent, and arrogant. And clearly, this is not going in the right direction. We, as a people, as Americans, have yet to fully comprehend what we have to do to protect ourselves, but we're getting there as people are starting to see, and as Beijing is forcing us to realize that things are not going in the right direction.
So what should we do? I mean, we're down to the last couple of minutes, but I mean, what does that mean concretely in terms of policy?
Well, it means, for instance, that we need to bring our manufacturing either back home or close to us, so Mexico and Latin America, because, for instance, as we were just mentioning, manufacturing in Asia is not necessarily the best thing. So we're going to have to shorten our supply lines. We need to have a much more robust supply chain. So this is going to be one thing. Second of all, we have to deter China because as Xi Jinping views a failing situation, he very well may lash out. So it's important for us to protect our friends and allies in the region. And I think that we are going to have to demand reciprocity from China. We allow China to do many things in our country that the Chinese do not allow Americans to do in theirs. And I'm specifically talking about the media. They can have an open access to our media platforms. We have extremely restricted access to theirs. We have to demand reciprocity. And if the Chinese won't give it to us, which they're not, we're going to have to start turfing out Chinese media like China Daily, China Global Television, all the rest of them. They have to leave. So this is going to be we need to have a recognition, ultimately, that China's goal is to rule the world. Chinese leaders tell us that that's their goal. We don't listen. China has declared us to be a people's enemy. We don't listen. So therefore, we're going to have to understand the breadth of China's challenge to the United States.
Mr. Chang, I want you to thank you very much for making the time for us today.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.